foodborne illness, antibiotics in the food supply, pandemics. The technology exists to eliminate these risks baked into our food system. So why is it being kept on the sideline? Keep listening and learn about the safer food system tech not being used and why it's so important. Welcome to Puppies, Pandemics, and Public Health. I am Dr. Johnny Lieberman. If you've ever wondered how your everyday choices, including what you eat, what you buy, what you wear, and the medicines you take, impact your health, the health of your family, animals, and the planet, you are in the right place. Let's get to it. Hira Jaleel is a visiting assistant professor at the Center for Animal Law Studies at Lewis and Clark Law School in Portland, Oregon. Professor Jaleel teaches aquatic animal law, industrial animal agriculture law, and leads the Farmed Animal Protection Project. Her research interests include food law and aquaculture law. Hello, welcome to another episode of Puppies, Pandemics, and Public Health. Today, I am pleased to welcome Professor Hira Jaleel as my guest. Professor Jaleel, thank you so much for joining the show today.
Thank you for having me.
So we are going to cover a lot in today's podcast. Hira, I wanted to ask you, what is the most important piece of information, one item that you want to be sure the public does not miss through everything we're going to talk about today? What would that be?
Thanks for asking that question. So I think the one point that I want to make, because we'll be talking about cell-cultivated meat, colloquially known as cultivated meat, is that it's not a magic wand solution. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution to what's currently a deeply broken food system in the United States. However, cultivated meat does have the potential to be one tool in the toolbox to combat the myriad of harms of industrial animal agriculture, such as poor animal welfare, environmental pollution, and public health risks. As such, consumers should have the freedom to decide for themselves whether cultivated meat is for them, and preemptive bans on cultivated meat, which we will be talking about, defeat that aim. And so for this, among other reasons, cultivated meat bans are problematic and they deserve to be closely scrutinized.
You brought up more than one point, but that's fine because they're all important. And we're going to be touching on all of those in today's session. One of the points you brought up, what do you mean when you say the food system is broken? Because I don't think most people see it that way. I know as recently as a couple of years ago, I didn't see it that way. So what do you mean by the food system is broken?
That's a good question, and I will have a lot of trouble answering that in a couple of minutes, but I'll try my best. And I'll just broadly cover some of the main harms of our industrialized animal agricultural system. And by industrialized, I mean a system that's marked by intensive confinement of animals, by a lot of vertical and horizontal integration, by a lot of consolidation in the industry. So, gone are the farms that come to mind, the bucolic pastures where animals are free roaming and are living their best lives. Most animals don't live like that in today's modern day industrialized factory farms. In fact, 99% of animals raised in the US for food are raised in intensive confinement, and they suffer immensely in intensive confinement. They are subjected to painful husbandry procedures such as tail docking, castration without anesthesia, dehorning, other mutilations, and they're overall just denied the ability to exhibit species-specific behaviors that they would in their natural state of being, or if they were allowed to just exist the way they wanted to.
Let me pause here to just emphasize all these practices that you mentioned sound horrific, and they're done every single day on farms across the country. And what's an estimate of the scope of this? How many animals every day are farmed in this system? You mentioned 99%. How many animals are subject to this?
We're talking about 10 billion land animals. And when I say land animals, I'm excluding aquatic animals. So I'm not talking about fish. I'm not talking about shrimp. I'm also, in fact, not talking about insects who are also farmed. I'm just talking about the species that we really think of when we think of farmed animals like pigs, cows, sheep, chickens. We're talking about 10 billion of them every year in the United States alone. So that's surpassing the human population of the world. We're slaughtering more animals than that in the US alone every year.
Now, thanks for expanding on that. When you say the number 10 billion, it's hard to wrap your head around it, I think. So I think it's a value that's more than the population on Earth. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Human population? 10 billion animals. The suffering is on a massive scale. Please continue.
Yeah. And I also briefly wanted to touch upon public health and environmental concerns associated with traditionally produced slaughtered meat, because we're also going to be talking about cultivated meat, which is in opposition to obviously slaughtered meat. And so traditional animal agriculture is, and this is something I'm sure you've already covered in the podcast and you are an expert on, which is, notorious for its high risk of zoonotic disease spread, overuse of prophylactic antibiotics, which are both, of course, significant public health concerns. Also, traditional animal agriculture is a serious environmental liability, both in terms of its climate impact, the greenhouse gas emissions, most notably due to methane from ruminants, cows, as well as water and air pollution that resulted from certain agricultural facilities. I'm sure it's not hard to imagine you're confining a lot of animals in a really small amount of space. There's a lot of waste that those animals produce, and that waste is really noxious and harmful for people living next to these factory farms or concentrated animal feeding operations. So all in all, there's just very little good news when it comes to industrial animal agriculture. It's just a really broken system, like I said earlier, and a system that's propped up by the government that we can get into if you want to.
Yes, absolutely. The harms, as Hira pointed out, are not just to the animals and these horrible husbandry conditions and extreme close confinement. The harms extend out to the environment, destruction of the environment, pollution of the environment that humans need to live in, and then direct consequences to humans, human health. The food itself that's produced, certainly when consumed in the quantities it is unhealthy. The risk of zoonotic disease transmission, like avian flu, like COVID, and antibiotic resistance and transfer of antibiotic resistant bacteria. The consequences of our current food system are just devastating across the board. Just wanted to emphasize that here. That was a really great summary in about 5 minutes or less. And you mentioned cultivated meat. Would you like to talk a little bit and share what that is, maybe what it isn't, and how, as you touched on, this represents a tool in the toolbox for solving some of the myriad of problems created by our current industrial food animal production system?
Yeah, so I'll start with just talking about what cultivated meat is and then talk about why it's a tool in the toolbox, like you just said. So, also known as human food made with cultured animal cells, but that's a lot to say, so I will call it cultivated meat. This technology just involves taking a small number of cells from an animal and then using them indefinitely to create food in a controlled environment. So, the way the process works is that you acquire cells from an animal. This acquisition process does not necessarily permanently harm or kill said animal. The cells are then stored in a bank and grown in bioreactors at high densities and volumes. They are fed an oxygen rich cell culture medium containing basic ingredients like amino acids, glucose, vitamins, growth factors, etc. And then when you change that medium composition in tandem with something called a scaffolding structure, which you can kind of think of like a building structure, it triggers immature cells to differentiate into skeletal muscle, fat, and connective tissue that make up meat. Then these cells are harvested, they're prepared, and they're packaged into a final product that at the end of the day is animal muscle tissue. So it is meat. The process takes about 2 to 8 weeks, depending on the kind of meat being cultivated. And so some companies are producing cell cultivated meat, but they're also trying to pursue a similar strategy to create milk and other animal products. And cultivated meat, I think the reason why it's important or it's a tool in the toolbox is because it ameliorates a lot of these problems that we discussed earlier. We're talking about animal suffering, about 10 billion land animals. So cultivated meat would not require raising animals in extreme confinement or subjecting them to cruel, harmful practices like mutilations, etc., in order to slaughter, in order to obtain flesh from those animals. Also, again, we talked about public health and environmental concerns. A lot of those concerns are also linked to raising animals in extreme confinement. And when you don't do that, then you don't have the same problems. So, for example, studies on cultivated meat production illustrate that it has the potential to be more efficient, to have a lower carbon footprint than conventionally farmed animals or even seafood. And on the public health front, since cultivated meat does not involve intensive animal confinement and can be produced in a much more controlled environment, it should ideally do away with many of the effects of conventionally produced meat, such as water and air pollution, overuse of antibiotics, risk of zoonotic disease spread, etc.
It certainly sounds like an exciting technology, and creating a product which is the same as what you get. Let's take a chicken breast, for example. I feel like that's one of the models that's out there. I feel like there are already companies which have developed that and growing a chicken breast in a sterile lab environment. I just wanted to highlight a couple of things which jump out to me and which should jump out many as advantages, going a little bit beyond, as Hira just mentioned. It's become the norm in our society that when you go to a grocery store to buy a raw meat product, chicken breast, chicken thigh, ground beef, that it's contaminated with bacteria. That's become the norm. And I don't think that why it's contaminated occurs to most people. Contamination rates are well north of 50% in grocery store raw meat products, higher than 70% in turkey has been reported. And what are they contaminated with? They're contaminated with stool bacteria from these animals routinely. E. coli is one of the common ones I think most people have heard of. That's a bacteria that lives in human stool. It lives in animal stool. It's normal in the intestine, but because these animals in this close confinement live waiting in their own stool and the stool of nearby animals because they can't escape it, the meat product that they get turned into, more often than not, is still contaminated with that bacteria as residual from the stool. That's the norm. And what are the human consequences of that? You eat it. It's often routine that their feed gets laced with antibiotics. You're consuming those antibiotics. You're consuming the remnants of stool that those animals spend nearly their entire life in. We consider that normal now. Cultivated meat represents another way to do it. That's one. And the other one is the risk of zoonoses transmission or an infection. For example, bird flu gets introduced into a hen house where there's a bunch of chickens, maybe 5, 10,000 of them. One bird gets infected, the whole flock gets slaughtered. Why? Because the transmission rate is high and the death rate is high. And then the government will use our taxpayer dollars to pay the farmer for that. And that bird flu or whatever virus we're talking about is, then it has a chance to mutate and go to the public. Another advantage of this model, the risk of that is zero. Zero. There's going to be no risk for a virus mutating and turning into a pandemic strain or even a non-pandemic strain that can infect workers and local residents and then potentially spread to the public. The risk is zero. And the meat that's produced is going to be sterile. There's going to be zero chance of you getting antibiotics from eating that into your system, zero chance of picking up E. coli or other stool bacteria. As a clinician, as a physician, as well as someone interested in food policy and looking at the bigger picture of public health, this makes a lot of sense. What's holding it back? From what I recall, there's only a small number of companies working on it. I think you're going to talk about freedom of choice for what you can buy in certain states. What's holding it back from taking off?
Just to kind of map out the landscape of cultivated meat in the US, right now, cultivated meat at the federal level is being regulated jointly by the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, and the US Department of Agriculture, the USDA, specifically the Food Safety and Inspection Service, which is a sub-agency of the USDA. So in 2022, two cell-cultivated meat companies, Good Meat and Upside Foods, received pre-market review and approval from the FDA to sell cultivated meat in the US. In June of 2023, the USDA FSIS issued the first ever grant of inspection to the two companies. A grant of inspection is needed in order for your facility to actually have an inspector on the line to inspect the meat that you're producing, and you cannot actually sell the product without an inspector on the line under the current law. So in 2023, they received the first ever grants of inspection to produce cell-cultivated chicken in their facilities and to label the products as such, as cell-cultivated chicken. In July 2023, Upside Foods and Good Meat sold the first cell-cultivated chicken in restaurants in San Francisco and DC. The way cultivated meat products are being regulated, specifically the labeling, is mirroring the way conventionally produced meat products are regulated. So the production process is being jointly regulated by the FDA and the USDA, but because the USDA regulates labeling for certain livestock meat products and the FDA regulates labeling of seafood, the FDA is responsible for approving cultivated salmon products. So in 2025, Wild Type received a no questions letter, which is basically the FDA said it doesn't have objections or it doesn't have any further questions about its cultivated salmon. Wild Type's cultivated salmon is being offered for sale, not again in grocery stores, because cell cultivated meat hasn't gone that far yet, but in a restaurant in Portland, which actually you told me about. So yeah, it's just in restaurants so far. And the reason why it's taking a while to take off is because of funding, right? Money. And again, I don't represent these companies. I'm an academic. I have no association at all with Good Foods or Upside Foods or Wild Type. I'm not here as an advocate of cultivated meat, but that said, I am here to advocate for consumer choice and for ensuring that the law doesn't skew consumer choice or funnel it into one specific direction. I personally don't think that's something the government should necessarily be doing when it comes to alternative proteins. In terms of just the funding that traditionally produced meat receives versus cultivated meat, there's something you talk about subsidy imbalance. I know that's something you like talking about. So I'll just, if that's okay with you, I'll dive a little bit.
Please share the subsidy imbalance, because I think that plays an enormous role in whether or not this technology is going to thrive and succeed and have a fair chance to compete fairly with traditional meat or not.
Exactly. So right now there's a question of scale. Firstly, it's a matter of producing cultivated meat at the scale necessary to be able to put it in grocery stores. It's also the problem of price, right? You don't want it to be a product that is basically inaccessible to most people. When we talk about that price aspect specifically, that's where the subsidy imbalance becomes very clear cut. So conventional meat, just to clarify, sits on top of decades of public policy that is artificially lowering its cost and cushioning its risks. And the way that's happening is through direct and indirect subsidies. First, taxpayers cover a large share of premiums for farmers that grow feed for animals like corn and soy. So in 2024 alone, federal premium subsidies under the crop insurance program were about $10.5 billion. And that's before you even count other program costs. And then you add kind of direct commodity payments. That's another 9.3 billion. So basically what's happening is that the federal government is funding corn, soybeans, and providing subsidies to the farmers growing corn and soybeans. And those crops are going to feed animals for animal agriculture, which makes it very, very cheap for livestock producers, right? Because the federal government is indirectly subsidizing them. And then even directly, there's infrastructure support that the government provides, which is framed as conservation, but it essentially defrays cost for large livestock operations. So the USDA has something called the EQIP program, where producers can get cost share for manure and waste management infrastructure. So think like waste storage facilities, etc. And like we talked about earlier, a lot of these large factory farms or concentrated animal feeding operations, which is the legal term of art, they produce a lot of waste and they need to store and transport that waste. And so they're essentially being funded by the federal government to build those storage facilities and to transport their waste. And comparing those subsidies that have been in place for a really long time to alternative proteins, especially cultivated meat, public support does exist, but it's a very different order of magnitude. So I talked about billions earlier. Here we're talking about like the low millions. So Congress
I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you again here. I want to try and put in perspective. So 20 billion plus a year, the federal taxpayer through the government supports the massive agribusiness industry that produces a large majority, close to 100% of our meat that's consumed in this country. The scale of that is hard to comprehend. We're talking about this many dollars, but in research that I've done, I'll quote a couple of numbers, which will try and help put that in perspective. An economist, I think his name was David Simon, estimated, I think 2017 or 18, for example, a Big Mac at the time was about $4. And so how much subsidy is going into the system? What would the real cost be if you were going to go into a store in 2017 and buy a Big Mac? It would be $11. Expand that to every single grocery store, every single restaurant that's out there. As Hira mentioned, our food system is propped up by federal subsidies. It's hard to think of another business model that gets anywhere near that much support, not to mention the insurance. The back end, if they have a problem turning a profit or going under, the government backstops that. In the private sector, if you can't turn a profit after a while, you shut down. The ag industry gets a break, a massive break that other businesses that also produce very important products don't get. The scale of it is enormous. Go ahead and let's talk about what, if anything, these cultivated meat companies are getting.
Yeah, so my research has turned up that the USDA has maybe put in about $20 million over the past decade into cultivated meat research and just the industry. Conventionally produced meat, we're talking about an annual billions of dollars. Whereas with cultivated meat, we're talking about $20 million across 10 years. So that's peanuts in comparison. And that puts in context this discussion of why cultivated meat struggles to reach scale, right? So part of it is pretty simple that conventional meat benefits both directly and indirectly from long-standing federal programs that stabilize prices and shift risk, right? And help finance even the infrastructure of these facilities. And cultivated meat, by contrast, is mostly backed by private capital and comparatively modest public research and development support. So, of course, and again, just to clarify, I'm not arguing that farmers don't need support or that we should like completely eliminate farm safety nets. But I think when we discuss why certain products aren't competing the same way with other products, it's important to think about structurally what's going on, right? Like, where is the money going? Follow the money, like they say. Yeah, that's just the point I wanted to make.
Thanks for bringing that up. Getting at the scale, it's a real issue. However, this has been solved before with traditional meat. And if you'd like to expand on it, I'd love to hear it. But pre-World War II, I don't think the CAFO model now was the dominant one, or maybe it was starting to become that. However, technology advanced, demand increased, and partially as a result of private capital and motivation, and partially a result of the government, the scale problem was solved. We now, going post World War II, 50s, 60s, 70s, and even more going forward, it's been solved to the point of, unfortunately for the animals and the public as the consequences, they're viewed as just a commodity to be turned from a living sentient being into a food product as quickly and cheaply as possible. But on an economic and business model side, the scale problem was there. It's been solved. So is it possible that can happen again with cultivated meat if there's an interest and desire to do so?
Yeah, why not?
So what are the barriers standing in the way? This is an exciting new technology that solves so many of the problems of our broken food system. As a business owner as well, I feel like I like to see the customer be able to compete, or the businesses be able to compete on a level playing field. And if we can get to that point, let the consumer decide if it's going to take off. Do you see a pathway to getting to that point, or should we be talking about it or not?
Absolutely. I think I'll plug in some of the research I'm doing for a law review article I'm currently working on, which is about cell cultivated meat and the dormant commerce clause. I'm not going to get too legal with it because I know we have limited time. So I've already discussed how we have 3 companies right now that have been federally approved to sell their cultivated meat products in the US and are only selling them in select restaurants and not in grocery stores. The technology just isn't at a point where you and I could just go to like our local grocery store and buy cultivated meat off the shelves. However, we do have 8 states at this point, to my knowledge, that have passed bans on the manufacturing, sale, or distribution of cultivated meat. These states include Alabama, Florida, Indiana, Montana, Mississippi, Nebraska, and Texas. There's some litigation that's challenging these state level bans. Upside Foods and Wild Type are leading this litigation in Florida and Texas. So the Florida litigation is the earliest because Florida's ban is the earliest. So Upside Foods filed a complaint to challenge the constitutionality of Florida's ban on cultivated meat. And they're making a couple of arguments. One argument is under the supremacy clause of the Constitution, which basically talks about how federal law is superior to state law and where federal law preempts state law.
Sorry, here, I'm going to interrupt before we go
Yeah.
into this, which I do want to hear. What's the rationale or what's the impetus for these states trying to ban the sale of a product that the consumer might want? I mean, the businesses themselves must think there's somewhat of a demand, otherwise they wouldn't be investing in it. And it's adding a increasing consumer choice to the market. What's behind trying to ban the sale of it?
That's an excellent question, and perhaps I should have led with that. But the impetus is to protect the ag industry. So these bans are, in my view, clearly protectionist in nature. They are passed almost purely to just protect the local conventional livestock industry.
Not really in the interests of the state residents or the public, correct?
Not in my opinion, and I'm basing my opinion on a lot of statements made by legislators when they were debating these laws, as well as by governors when signing these bills into laws, basically saying that we have a certain way of life, we need to protect our ag industry, we need to protect our livestock producers, and there's plenty of evidence that's publicly available to that effect. And so it's very much just to create a state-sponsored monopoly over animal agriculture. So the idea being that the state wants just one way to produce meat, and that way is by raising animals and slaughtering them, as opposed to the process that cultivated meat producers employ.
Thanks for sharing that. That sounds just devious to me. That sounds a law not acting on the interests of the public to protect an industry. As someone who's also a consumer, that just disheartens me. Maybe that disheartens you as a listening public. Do you want more consumer choice for the food products that you want to buy? Or do you want your local government not even giving you the option to try a new food product that's been FDA approved for sale? Think about that. Please, here, continue with the legal discussion.
Yeah, so just to simplify it and not get too much into the weeds, there are basically 2 arguments that these companies are making against these bans. One is under something called the preemption doctrine, which, like I said, is the idea that where Congress is claiming regulatory authority over a certain area, states can't regulate in that area, right? So if there's an indication that Congress meant to exclusively be the legislative body for a particular issue, then there's no room for state law to contradict or conflict with federal law. And so here, because we already talked about how cultivated meat is being regulated at the federal level under the Federal Meat Inspection Act, Poultry Products Inspection Act, depending on the product, cultivated meat product being produced, Upside Foods is arguing for its cell-cultivated chicken that because the Poultry Product Inspection Act already provides for how poultry products are going to be regulated, there's really no room for other states to be making additions to that regulatory scheme. Whether the bans are an addition or a different ingredient requirement, which is the language of the law, is something for the court to decide. Courts so far don't seem to be buying that argument, but the litigation is at a very, very early stage. Courts do seem to be buying a little bit more the second argument, which I also personally think is the stronger argument that these companies are making, which is the dormant commerce clause argument. And essentially, the Dormant Commerce Clause is an implication of the Commerce Clause of our Constitution, which prevents states from enacting laws that discriminate against or unduly burden interstate commerce. In my view, these bans are purely motivated by economic protectionism, trying to protect one industry over another industry. And that's something that states cannot do because Congress has the exclusive purview to legislate on matters of interstate commerce. The idea that states can erect barriers to trade with other states, domestic barriers to trade, is something that's historically been frowned upon under the US's constitutional scheme. I think there's a stronger argument there that by passing these bans, which are clearly motivated by economic protectionism, all these states are running afoul of the Dormant Commerce Clause and trying to essentially give one industry an economic boost at the expense of another industry that's mostly, if not exclusively, out of state. We still need to see how all of this will play out. In my view, I think the Dormant Commerce Clause claims are strong enough. I think it's blatantly unconstitutional in my view, and pretty clearly so under the Dormant Commerce Clause.
So the implications of these first two lawsuits could be enormous. If I'm interpreting that correctly, should it go up to a higher level, to the Supreme Court, for example, and it's determined, as you're not thinking would be the case, yes, these laws are constitutional. It's okay to prohibit the sale of this in our state. That could have devastating consequences for the whole industry. Am I kind of walking that pathway correct?
You're absolutely right in noting that if these bans are allowed to stand, if the litigation fails in that, if Upside Foods and Wild Type are unsuccessful in their lawsuits, then yes, because the industry is so nascent, because it really relies on a national market, I feel it's very easy to reach that tipping point where if enough states ban the industry or ban the product, then the industry basically goes out of business, right? It really does need to have enough consumer demand or enough of a consumer base to actually purchase the product. And if you're shutting off entire huge markets, like think Florida and Texas are huge markets, right? They're big states. And so if you're shutting off those avenues completely, then that's a big blow to the cultivated meat industry.
And on the flip side, should they prevail, I think that should open the door for them to expand to other states. And maybe that would encourage even more nascent companies that are out there, if there are any, to say, yeah, I can do this too. To me, seems, even as a potential consumer and someone interested in this space, this seems like really important cases that you brought up for this sector.
I definitely think so. Again, consumer acceptance is a big piece of the puzzle. And it's true. I think there's been research into the fact that a lot of consumers aren't entirely comfortable with the idea of cultivated meat. There is just something about the idea of lab grown meat that people don't always necessarily like. I think that the product and the industry should be allowed to compete on its own terms. And if there's no consumer acceptance for it, then just in any capitalist economy, if there's no consumer demand, the industry will just go out of business or pivot to something else. But if there is enough consumer acceptance and demand, then you're absolutely right. There's no reason why even big livestock producers can't invest in cultivated meat technology or at least diversify their investments. So it could take off, it could not take off. It's too soon to tell. But all I'm saying, and the only proposition that I'm arguing for, is that this is something consumers should be allowed to decide in a democracy and not something that the state should be putting its finger on the scales, so to speak, for the livestock industry. Just let consumers decide whether they like cultivated meat or not.
Yeah. How do you feel about that? Do you want to decide on your own the merits and drawbacks of this? Do you prefer that your state says, no, you're not even going to have an option? Something to think about. Is there something that a resident in any of these states could do to make their voice heard?
Well, of course, we always have a voice when, it comes to voting for legislators who support certain agendas. And also, of course, there's legislative avenues. And like I said, when cultivated meat does hit the stores, if there's an option to go purchase it, if someone's cultivated meat curious, they can go out of state to purchase it or try it when they're traveling. So yeah, I think there's definitely ways to still support the technology if one wanted to.
Hira mentioned the general public discomfort about lab grown meat as opposed to traditionally raised meat. And I understand that as a consumer. As a scientist and a physician, I also understand that the narrative is heavily in favor of traditional meat. I feel like with more education onto what's really involved in the process, as well as a better understanding of what the animals that get turned into food in our traditional system go through, I think they can compete on more fair terms. I understand the uncertainty with a brand new technology, how it perhaps is considered unnatural, which if you compare it to the traditional way, it can be viewed like that. However, the idea of somehow taking a pig or a chicken, confining it in an extremely tight space its entire life, genetically manipulating it so that it grows abnormally fast, or in the case of a dairy cow, genetically manipulating it so it puts out at least double the amount of milk that its body is otherwise normally designed to put out, feeding these animals a diet that their bodies are not designed to eat, genetic manipulation and breeding to the point that chickens, for example, grow so abnormally fast that their legs can't support their body weight. Their legs literally break because they're growing so fast. And humans did that. How is that anywhere near natural? And their internal organs can't keep up with it. These animals die at unprecedented rates as a result of our genetic manipulation. Chickens die of heart failure because their hearts can't keep up with their abnormally growing bodies, and they suffer routinely from that. These animals were not designed to spend their entire lives indoors waiting in their own filth. I feel like there needs to be a more fair and balanced weighing of what's natural when anyone is thinking about, do I want a cell cultured, sterilely created chicken breast, or do I want one that has a genetically manipulated animal fed antibiotics all its life that's been living in its own stool? Is that any more natural than the chicken breast that's grown in the sterile conditions of a lab? Everyone needs to make their own choice on that. Certainly, the narrative and the dominant media has been the lab grown is unnatural, whereas a chicken that suffers its entire life in its own stool getting antibiotics, that's somehow natural. Consider that and look into it and decide for yourself. Hira mentioned her opinions based on these cases and other opinions. They're based on publicly available data, and everything we're talking about, our opinions aside, you can find with probably a couple of clicks with Google. And I encourage you to do so. It's not that clear of an argument once you consider all the facts that lab grown meat is not natural when you compare it with what's done with chickens and pigs and cows on factory farms. There are different degrees of unnatural. Everyone needs to decide for themselves. Personally, I think once you know the facts, you may make a different decision. I know I have. As we talked about, the way animals are turned into food compared to where we 70, 80 years ago, it's way different. The economies of scale have changed it. Eating a chicken today is not the same as eating a free range chicken running around the farm from 100 years ago. It's not. And there's significant risks to you from consuming these genetically bred animals that live in their own stool of their lives. There's risks to you. There's risks to the farmers and the workers raising the animals and their families who live nearby and all the residents. And when you factor in zoonoses, it's the global risk. A lot of those issues, if not all of them, get solved with this. One of the things that I've read and kind of stuck with me is there's something bigger than just a 15-minute satisfaction of your palate a few times a day. There's bigger issues at stake. I never thought about it like that until recently. It's more than just, let me satisfy my palate now. It doesn't matter what the costs are, because there are significant costs with your decisions that go beyond you, to your family members, to your friends and community, and to the planet. So if we touched on anything in these topics today that at least got you thinking, please look into it further, do your research. You may wind up seeing something in a different light that makes you change and makes you feel better about the decisions you make and the choices that affect you and everybody around you. So I encourage you to look into any of these topics that has sparked your interest and investigate further. Hira, we are coming up to the end. I want to give you a chance to close with any additional comments or points that you want to drive home, any calls to action beyond what you just mentioned for what our listening audience may be able to do starting today to make some changes. I'll let you close.
Thank you so much. I think you really summed it up very well. I don't think anything we eat nowadays, or not anything, but very few things are genuinely natural. Biotechnology has done wonders for our food system, and it's been really harmful for our food system, like you very rightly said. For me, it's really more about consumer sovereignty and fair competition, which are, I think, values that are pretty easy to get behind, in my opinion. States preemptively banning a lawfully federally regulated product to protect incumbents, in my opinion, is the wrong move, because it denies consumers information and choice. And it invites the kind of protectionism that our national market is supposed to avoid. And that's even something that the Constitution is designed to avoid. And so, in my view, the right approach is neutral, rigorous regulation, right? So we obviously need to make sure our food products are safe. We need to make sure they're clearly labeled so that people know what they're buying. And then we let the consumers decide. And if cultivated meat can deliver on taste, price, and values like animal welfare, environmental impact, worker standards, people would buy it. People care about these things. Research has shown that consumers care about higher welfare, they care about environmentally friendly products, and genuinely animal welfare and environmentally friendly products, not just humane washed or greenwashed products. And if cultivated meat can't deliver on that product, like I said, people won't buy it. Just to kind of sum up, again, cultivated meat is not a cure-all, but an open, transparent food system, I think, definitely goes a long way towards solving a lot of the problems that we're facing today and that many consumers are clearly unhappy with. So I think we just need the facts, we need guardrails, and then we can let the market decide.
I think that is a great ending for the show. And I'll add one more additional piece to that before we close. There's a handful of terms used to describe cultivated meat, cell cultured meat. I've even heard the term analog food product used. And clean meat is one that I've heard. I heard it first from George Kimbrell, who's active in this space. And to me, that sums it up as succinctly as possible. The animal food production process is the opposite of clean. It's dirty in every sense of the word. The way the animals are raised, the production process, the fact that the final food product is contaminated, more often than not, the entire process is just dirty. The cultivated meat process represents antithesis of that. It's truly clean. It's produced in a sterile environment. There's no antibiotics. There's no suffering. There's no deception. And you get a clean, sterile product. Just another term that I've heard out there. Personally, I like it. It really draws a line. It's a way to reframe it for those who never thought about it like that before. Hira, thank you so much for being on the show. I appreciate all your thoughts, your opinions, your summary of so much of the information that's out there, and the emphasis on consumer choice as a driving force behind a lot of this. Thank you for sharing your time and your thoughts, Hira.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. These conversations aren't always easy, but they're important and worth having. Take what resonates, ask questions, and keep learning.
If you enjoyed this episode or otherwise just interested in learning more, you can email me at john@cultivatedmeat.com. johnliebermanmd.com. That's John, John, at JOHNLIEBERMANMD.com.